Good afternoon, average engineers. It's a rainy and wet afternoon in the Midwest. It's pretty terrible outside, so I thought I'd talk about Databricks. I don't know how those two are related, but whatever. Recently, I wrote a little Substack post on Databricks Compute, just talking about the different types of Databricks Compute and when to use them, talking about cost and ease of use, etc. Recently, it seems like the ground has been kind of shifting a lot when it comes to Databricks Compute, at least from my perspective. Serverless stuff has come out quite a bit, and then the cost around serverless has been up and down and everywhere, people saying different things about it, and sometimes I just forget there's a lot of people not that familiar with Databricks or new to it, so I'm just going to give you, at least from my perspective, a high level overview of the different types of compute on Databricks and when I think you should use each of them. Again, I don't pretend to be a Databricks expert or anything like that. I just have used it every day for a couple years, so this is really just from my perspective. Your use case may be different. And just as a side note, mostly what I'm going to talk about is from an AWS standpoint, so running Databricks on AWS with the background. I don't know how much of this stuff, a decent amount of it would transfer over to platforms like Azure, GCP, etc. But again, I'm looking at it from an AWS standpoint. Okay, so if we just start from a super high level, if you're brand new to Databricks, what kind of compute can I use? I've kind of put them in, I guess, 3 or 4 different categories. I would call them 4 different categories most likely. So we start with serverless, which is fairly new. You'll hear a lot about it. You also hear a lot of people talk about how expensive it is, serverless, and that's just what it sounds like. You could just assign whatever job or whatever code you're doing to run on serverless, and of course you wouldn't have to wait for a server startup time or anything like that. It's just magic, like a Lambda. The next kind of compute is SQL Warehouse, and they both have classic warehouse and serverless warehouses, and these are basically just what they sound like. They're for SQL workloads. They just run all the time. They call them SQL warehouses. A lot of people will use them to connect things like Tableau to your SQL warehouse, or maybe if you have a bunch of users, you can have them all use a SQL warehouse that runs. And that's basically a little cluster of compute that you decide on. The next is probably the most popular, the one that most people should use. The third one is called just what I would call job compute, and it runs a little bit cheaper. It's probably one of the lowest cost compute to run on Databricks. That's what most people should be using most of the time. And then we have the dreaded fourth, which is all-purpose compute, and this is probably one of the most expensive ways to operate on Databricks, and yet a lot of people spend a lot of time and resources running code on all-purpose clusters and drive up their cost exponentially by doing so. Here's a little visual I put together about just a high-level Databricks compute overview. Just kind of reiterates what we just talked about. We have serverless compute. You can use that against notebooks. A lot of people do, or you do have serverless compute you can use with jobs. Again, this is sort of new. I still think there's a lot of things to shuffle out here. A lot of people say it's expensive. Of course, if you're running something really quick, you just have a piece of code you want to run and you don't want to wait for a cluster to spin up and start, then serverless is obviously a good option. But if you're running something that takes an hour, you should probably not use serverless. Again, we talked about all-purpose compute. A lot of people basically tie all-purpose to a notebook, and that's basically what happens. And they let the all compute run all the time. It's much more expensive than job compute. So, when you think about when to use what, all-purpose, you're playing around with a notebook doing some exploratory data analysis. That's going to be all-purpose, and it's going to cost you more, whereas compared to if you have just scheduled jobs that run, that compute is much, much cheaper. And of course, you have the SQL warehouses like we talked about. I'm going to try not to get bogged down in the minute details of each one of these types of compute and agonize over this and that, whatever. I'm just going to give you like a super high level of how I think about compute when I'm working on Databricks, and maybe it'll be helpful for you. Here's some of the rules of thumb that I operate by. I use job compute at all times because it's cheap. When other people are using notebooks to do analysis, to run things, I'm using job compute. If you use job compute all the time, or for 90% of the stuff you're running on Databricks, it's going to be much cheaper than any other approach you take, most likely. And again, we have our SQL warehouses, and kind of my thing there is, this is if you need on-demand support for analytics and third-party apps. For example, say you have Tableau that's running a bunch of dashboards. You can connect Tableau to a SQL warehouse, so it kind of hits your data in Databricks live and run its queries and do its thing. I personally think that's about the only use case. If you have some sort of third-party app like Tableau, you needed something to connect to, some compute for it to connect to. SQL warehouses can be used for that sort of thing. And again, we talk about all-purpose clusters. Again, I think that is short-lived notebook research. Keyword short-lived. A lot of people don't do this. What ends up happening on large Databricks environments is people run multiple all-purpose clusters and they use them all day long, basically to develop code and to run code. And it's an extremely expensive way to develop your code and your data platform working on all-purpose clusters and notebooks all the time. Number one, it's not a very good development life cycle because it's kind of willy-nilly. People do whatever they want. Notebook development is bad when you're talking about production code. You should start in an IDE. And number two, it's extremely expensive. This is the most expensive type of compute you can run on Databricks. So why are you leaving your all-purpose clusters running all day and just running random things on there? It's just an extremely good way to spend a lot of money that you don't need to. And then again, I see serverless as a quick question that you want an instant answer to. That's when I look at serverless. Maybe if you have like a 5-minute Spark job, and again, you could ask, why are you running a job that takes 5 minutes on Spark? Because obviously you could be using Daft, Polars, DuckDB, and not even use Spark and pay for the extra charges. So again, serverless, in my opinion, it's got to be something super quick, over and done with. That's when you should use it. And I do want to take another little sidestep here and again get on my soapbox and talk about all-purpose compute. You should not have all-purpose compute running all day long to do a lot of stuff. You're wasting money. If you're running a notebook and messing around, you're running stuff that takes 30 minutes to run, switch it to a job. You know how easy that is? You can just click around in the UI. You can go over to workflows. You can click new workflow. You can select your notebook and just run that job, and all of a sudden it's way cheaper to do that because you're running it quote unquote as a job and not against an all-purpose compute cluster that costs twice as much. And again, I think right now I just tell people avoid serverless most of the time. Use it for quick short answers that you need to, but for generally it sounds kind of expensive. That's generally what you'll hear if you go look it up on LinkedIn, anywhere else. Kind of the consensus is serverless is expensive. So be careful, only use it if you need a quick answer to a quick question. And again, if you decide to use a SQL warehouse and leave it running all day long, pay attention to your scaling. Does it have auto shut off? Will it shut off after an hour of nobody using the SQL warehouse, etc.? What's the scaling look like for it? You could spend a lot of money again if you just leave a SQL warehouse running 24/7 without touching the configs. I also want to give you just a few high-level thoughts about compute and ways to save money. And again, this is kind of from an AWS perspective, but when we're talking about compute on Databricks, you need to understand the difference between spot and on-demand instances, including spot with fallback. On-demand pricing is way more expensive than spot, and if you need something to run and not fail, you can put spot with fallback, so it might hit a spot instance, fall back to on-demand. A lot of times people put an on-demand as the node of the cluster and then everything else, the workers, as spot. That's very smart, save you a lot of money. Another thing a lot of people don't do that they should is use fleet clusters. This is sort of new, sort of not. It auto selects the best pricing and availability from a pool for you automatically. So instead of saying, I want this specific cluster, go ahead and use fleet clusters. It'll save you a little bit of money, not a ton, but a little bit. And again, if you have a lot of jobs running on Databricks, you should consider using Databricks workflows. You can integrate it with Airflow. I'm not saying replace something like Airflow with the workflows. What I'm saying is you can use workflows, and it allows you to use a single job cluster across multiple job tasks instead of spinning up a cluster for every single task, which can be expensive and time consuming, waiting for each of those task cluster to spin up and to run. You can save a lot of time and money by using one job cluster and running multiple workflows or tasks on that single job cluster. Check it out. And just another side comment, you need to tune your Spark clusters. Go figure out what your workloads look like, how much resources are actually being used on that cluster, what's the CPU memory usage of those jobs that have been running. Just go ahead and tune your jobs. A lot of people don't even do this. It can be worth your time just to spend 5 minutes and looking at, hey, maybe I can scale this cluster down by a node or two and save some money. And make sure when it comes to all-purpose clusters and SQL warehouses that you look at the auto shut-off settings. Set them to something like 5 minutes or less. I think it defaults to something like 45 minutes, meaning like if somebody doesn't shut something off after they use it, which they probably won't, it's just going to keep running indefinitely. Just, turn down those shut-off settings maybe to some super low 10 minutes and you'll save some money definitely when it comes to all-purpose clusters. And again, if you need to use a lot of all-purpose clusters because you have a lot of analysts and data scientists running things throughout the day, make them share a cluster. Just set up one cluster, make them all use it. They can learn to be like in kindergarten again and share. I did a little poll on Substack when I had posted my thoughts about Databricks Compute, and I thought it'd be interesting to look at the results. I asked, do you care about your Databricks Compute costs? And 80% of people said yes, so 80-20 rule. It's interesting. People care about compute costs. They just don't spend a lot of time working on it. And I asked another obvious question, and everybody answered it right. It's what's going to save you the most money? And people said at job compute, which is true. And then they also said spot, which is true. So just do the obvious, and you'll save some money on your Databricks Compute.